Alright, hello everyone. This is going to be a much more informal video where I go over my top 10 favorite castles, some of their history, some unique things about their structure, and I will naturally include a lot of pictures for your enjoyment. So the first castle on my list at number 10 is Conwy Castle in Wales. This is one of the great Welsh castles built by Edward I near the end of the 13th century as part of his program of securing the English occupation of northern Wales. He built a series of really large castles. Some of these castles include Rhufflan, Flint, Conwy, Carnarvon, Beaumaris, Harlech, and Aberystwyth. Conwy is my favorite of these for several reasons. It was very well constructed and more or less completed, unlike, say, Carnarvon, which, while it ought to have been grander in scale than Conwy, was unfortunately never completed. Two is that it has a lot of unique features. One of which is that it's located on a promontory, but this promontory is very close to the sea and so has access to shipping from the sea. And so when Edward I was at one point trapped in the castle by a bunch of Welsh rebels under Madog ap Llewellyn, he was able to import countless supplies from all around England, Ireland, and even Gascony, and survive for several months and then break out at the end of wintertime. So the castle has 8 towers, as you can see in this image. The towers are large enough that even many of them have towers on them. It's equipped with just about everything you could want in a castle. It has some magicalations, it has countless arrow slits, it has windows for its lodgings. It has a very well built barbican. It has another barbican outside of its outer gate by the sea, which counts as another ward. It's divided into two main wards, an inner ward where the king's chambers and the king's chapel are, and an outer ward which has, the stables, the kitchens, the barracks, the great hall, and such. All in all, a very good castle. This was built by Master James of St. George, who we will actually return to later. So, next on my list is Corvin Castle in Romania. So this was the seat of the Hunyadi family in Romania. Although this was all part of the Kingdom of Hungary at the time, this castle is in Transylvania. So this was the seat of the Hunyadi family, of which the two most famous members are John, or Jan Jancu de Hunadora in Romanian, or János Hunyadi in Hungarian, and Matthias Hunyadi, or Matthias Corvinus, who would later be King of Hungary. János Hunyadi, or Jancu de Hunadora, was a great regent of the Kingdom of Hungary who led his country to countless victories against the Ottomans. And his son, who would later be elected King of Hungary, also did a lot for Hungary. And he was actually the first non-Italian prince to adopt the Renaissance. And you could see Renaissance touches in the castle, which were added under Matthias Hunyadi, like in the loggia here. All in all, it's a pretty cool castle. People often like to associate it with Vlad the Impaler, but there's really no evidence that he ever spent any time there. Some people will claim he was in prison there, but there's unfortunately no evidence. Yeah, all in all, it's a really cool castle. Very dramatic, gothic exteriors and interiors. It has a very good location. Like Conwy, it's on a promontory right next to a river, which is kind of a best of both worlds situations where you have access to a good defensible site and to resupply via the water. The next castle on my list is Malbork Castle. Now, Malbork Castle was also known as Marienburg, was the seat of the Teutonic Knights, and it's actually hard for me to show you guys what this entire castle looks like by picture because it is so huge. It is, by some estimates, the largest castle in the world, covering about 50 acres. Today, the castle is in Poland, but at the time it was part of the state possessed by the Teutonic Order. Um, like most castles of the Teutonic Knights, it is built around a fortified quadrangle, which also doubles as a cloister. You can see here a very cloister-like structure, and like most of these castles, it has a very tall tower at one of its corners. This castle is really, really impressive. Now, one of the things that sets it apart is that it's actually made of brick, mostly because the areas around the Baltic Sea are just not known for their plentiful stone, and so there was a need to use brick for it. The castle, in addition to its enormous size, has countless courtyards and extremely large halls that would have been home to thousands and thousands of knights. It, in fact, even had central heating and things like that, believe it or not. After the Battle of Tannenberg, the knights were able to put up quite a stiff resistance to King Jagiello of Poland and survive. Eventually, the castle was annexed by the Poles, and the rest of the lands of the Teutonic Order became a secularized vassal state to the Kingdom of Poland, and it served as one of the major palaces of the Crown of Poland. The next castle on my list is Chillon Castle in Switzerland. And this is a very unique castle because it is built opposite the shore of a lake on a small island. So one side is very heavily fortified, and the other side is relatively lightly fortified, as you could see from all the windows. And so you could say it's a palace on one side and a heavily fortified castle on the other. I mentioned James of St. George in connection to Conway Castle earlier, and while he wasn't involved in constructing this castle, the castle has numerous features in common with Conway, mainly in its scaffolding. This castle and Conway Castle use spiral scaffolding in the construction of the towers, which was a Savoyard technique that had hitherto been unknown in the British Isles. And using information like this, it was inferred that Master James of St. George was in fact a Savoyard. Here we have the dungeon in the basement. You can see the very, very impressive vaulting here. Lord Byron wrote a really, really cool poem about it called The Prisoner's Chillon, where he just, imagined someone who was kept there. This was one of the primary seats of the counts and later dukes of Savoy, but with the expansion of the Swiss Confederacy, the Bernese took over this part of Savoy, and Chillon Castle ended up being used as a prison. The next castle on my list is the Hohensalzburg. This is an enormous citadel, really, that looms on an enormous promontory or hill or what have you above the city of Salzburg in Austria, and it was the seat of the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg, who was, of course, one of the wealthiest princes in the empire, as I believe I've mentioned before. Here's an image that shows its evolution from the late 15th century to the early 1600s, and it kept being upgraded after that. In addition to its medieval core, its late medieval core, you could see enormous bastions from which one could fire cannons and the like, and which could also withstand cannon fire. This castle is absolutely huge. It covers like about 12 acres overall, and it's really an entire video could be made about it. I've written papers about it for German class, for Pete's sake. It has so many rooms and so many chambers. One notable example is the Golden Hall, where the Prince Archbishop would stay, and also the Fürstenzimmer, the Prince's Chambers. You can see here the gilded wooden vaulting on the ceilings. All in all, a really magnificent castle. Later on in the 18th century, the princes spent most of their time in the residence unfortunately, which always makes me sad. It always makes me sad that a lot of fortresses and castles were abandoned in favor of pansy palaces. The next castle on my list is the medieval Louvre. Now, unfortunately, I can't show you what the castle looks like today because it was razed down to its foundations in order to build the modern Louvre in Paris. But so this castle was originally built by King Philip Augustus in the 1190s, and it was commissioned by him right before he went on the Third Crusade. And it's considered one of the earliest castles of the Philippian style, which consists of a square or rectangle with corner towers at each end and several towers in between, and usually one or two towers between each of those corner towers, and then a large round keep at the center. And so it marks the transition from castles which are primarily centered around a fortified keep and weakly fortified baileys and a integrated and self-reinforcing mode of defense. This particular castle was later expanded and beautified under King Charles V in the 14th century, who turned it into one of the finest palaces of its day in Europe, as you can see in this image from Les Très Riches du Duc de Berry, a book of hours commissioned by his brother, as you can also see in these various models. The Great Tower, even long after it was razed, was somewhat metonymic for the French crown in general. You would do homage to... People wouldn't necessarily say do homage to the crown. You would say something like do homage to the Great Tower of the Louvre. The Great Tower would host much of the French treasury throughout much of its history. Unfortunately, like I said, it was destroyed in the early 16th century to make way for the modern Louvre, which, the modern Louvre was a very nice building, but I have to say I really prefer the castle. The next castle on my list, unfortunately, also I can't really show much in the way of images of it because it was destroyed by the Germans in World War I. Or rather, I should say it was destroyed by Erich Ludendorff in an act of petty spite in World War I. I don't have anything against Germans, but I do hate Erich Ludendorff. So this castle was notable for having the largest keep in all of Christendom. It was 55 meters tall and about 35 meters in diameter. And each of those corner towers was 20 meters in diameter and 40 meters tall. And so each one of them was actually larger than the Great Tower of the Louvre. It was built by Enguerrand de Coucy in the early 13th century. It was actually built fairly quickly, in just about a decade, which is very, very fast for a castle this large. It's often been said that the castle was built on really on a scale for giants. Sometimes I wonder if Harrenhal was inspired by it, since it has 5 great towers, and, all of them are larger than many keeps, and all of them are built on a scale for giants. The Great Hall alone, as you can see from this image, is really almost the size of a cathedral. Just look at that. Look at that detail. Look at the size of those windows. It's just an absolutely incredible construction. The Lords of Coucy were known for being very proud. And what was interesting is they didn't have any title above that of Seigneur or Sire or Lord or Baron or what have you. In fact, they would often say, Roi ne suis, ni prince, ni duc, ni comte aussi, je suis le sire de Coucy, which means, I'm not a king, I'm not a prince, I'm not a duke, I'm not even a count, but I am the Lord of Coucy. They've often been referred to as the most powerful sub-committal or sub-count magnates in all of Europe at the time. This castle is in northeastern France in the Picardy region. Now, next on my list is Burg Eltz in Germany, in the Rhineland. Now, this is a very unique castle. It's really, really hard to convey just how unique this is. This was a castle built by a community of joint heirs. I mentioned these castles in my video on the Imperial Knights. It is, the German term for it is Ganerbenburg. Associated term for the lordship would be a Ganerbenschaft. This castle would have originally been founded by one branch of one family who would have built that tower, right, in the left part of this image. You could see the floor plan showing the different towers, and each color corresponds to a different branch of the family. And so There was a custom in Germany to split your inheritance between your sons instead of giving it just to the eldest son or whatever. And often what that meant was that they didn't have enough land to each have their own castle. And so what they would do is they would pool their resources and build a castle together. And, each branch of the family would have a major residential, fortified residential block or what have you. And then each branch of the family would contribute to the defenses of the castle, and they would share common defenses. Again, as you can see in this image. So you have the Platte-Elz, which was the original tower, the Kempenich house in red, the Rubenach house in yellow, and the Rodendorf house in blue. And these were the three branches. About 100 people, typically 100 members of the family, would actually live in the castle at any given time. Eventually, all but one of the branches sold their shares, though, and the castle is to this day owned by that family. Most of the castle is open to tourism, except the portion that they live in themselves. Number 2 on my list is Haut-Königsbourg in Alsace, France. So it's really more of a German castle, not a French castle, because it's in Alsace and it was built well before France annexed the region. This is a remarkable castle, and much like with Marienburg, it's really hard to use a picture to show you the entire castle, and so here is this model right here, which I think is pretty telling. You have the keep right in the center. You have countless baileys, countless towers. It's concentric, and yet it's also very long and narrow and built on a mountain. Like Berg-Eltz, this was also a Gon-Erbenburg, shared by a community of joint heirs. Unfortunately, I don't know much about the history of this castle. It was originally a royal foundation built by Frederick Barbarossa all the way back in the 12th century, but it was vastly expanded over the centuries and came into the possession of, I believe, a sequence of Swabian noble houses. Yeah, it's really just magnificent, and the detailing is incredible. You can look at some of these reconstructions that I found over the years, right here. Yeah, like for example, you have a gate right here, and then it winds around here, and it goes up all the way to the keep. The interiors are also very beautiful. A lot of this castle was restored under the Hohenzollerns after they annexed Alsace-Lorraine. The keep is probably a bit too tall. It was made a bit taller than it was historically, but I mean that's not something I'm going to complain too much about. The you have the Great Bastion, this very very fat tower, which was equipped with cannons and was meant to be defensible against cannon fire, and sort of represents the prototypical way in which castles were upgraded to deal with cannons before just bastions were developed. Anyway, so that is the second last. And now the last castle on my list, and this will surprise some of you, but it shouldn't, is Mehrgarh Fort in India. This is, without a doubt, the most magnificent fortification in the world, period. No competition. If you were to ask me to make a list like this again, I don't know if it would have all the same castles, and they definitely wouldn't be in the same order. The order was kind of arbitrary, but all I know for sure is that Mehrgarh Fort would be at the top. This castle covers about 20 acres. It has numerous palaces inside it. Really, it's built on a scale for giants. At some points, the walls are 36 meters high. And I mean, just look at where it is and how it looms over the surrounding city. This is in Rajasthan, India, and it was a Rajput construction and one of the seats of the Rajput kingdom of Mewar. And I believe it was still inhabited by its princes well into the 20th century. It might still be owned by the princes of Mewar, the titular princes of Mewar. I'm not sure. But just look at that. Just the architecture is absolutely incredible and detailed. Um, the gates had freaking spikes on it to prevent elephants from being used to bash them down. It just looks utterly inaccessible. You can see this model right here, which just shows um, how it was elaborated over the years. It shows like all the maze-like palaces in the on the upper left-hand side. It's beautiful. It comes from the term Mihirgar, which means something like Sun Castle, and it was built on a mountain called the Mountain of Birds. Right here, you can see the city of Jodhpur, where it's built. A lot of it is painted blue. I don't quite remember the story of that. I believe the Brahmins who live in the city paint their houses blue. Yeah, I really, 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 really love this castle. One might debate me and say, well, it's called a fort, but that's just because the British people in India at the time called most fortified buildings that they found forts, even if they were, for all intents and purposes, castles. Yeah, Rudyard Kipling called this construction not the work of men but of giants, and I am inclined to 100% agree with him. It was actually featured in The Dark Knight Rises, funny enough. Anyway, um, I hope that was informative. This was a much more impromptu video than usual. I kind of rambled a lot. I hope you enjoyed it, though. Have a wonderful day.